Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Avery, financial journalist, host of Classic Business on radio in Joburg and Cape Town, anchor of the COVID-19 Business Watch Daily Show on Business Day TV, and editor of Catalyst Private Equity Magazine. A warm welcome to everyone joining us on this webinar call this morning, and I hope you've got your coffee and your notebook handy as we set to deliver some rich insights during the next 60 minutes as we embark on a journey down the miracle on the Han River, as it's become known, to find out what we can learn as Africa from the Asian tiger's remarkable societal success story. Just briefly, I'd like to thank our partners on this journey, Mail and Guardian, for continuing to deliver such fantastic conversations and content. One of the top newspapers in the country by a country mile. As we know, all newspapers are struggling at the moment, and so I definitely encourage you to get on to the website and become a subscriber to support top quality journalism. Well, that's my little plug for the Mail and Guardian. The National Mentorship Movement is also an important partner bringing us this dialogue today, and it's doing incredible work at this time, striving to reach a target of creating 100,000 mentors in the country to help grow and build the next generation of organizational leaders that will hopefully drive South Africa forward into the next decade and beyond. And I owe much of my professional development to the mentorship of the late financial journalist and entrepreneur David Gleason. He took me under his wing almost directly out of university after I drifted around a few newsrooms and failed to get a cub posting. Affirmative action was a big part of South African life at that time in particular. And so I've experienced the value of mentorship firsthand. Now, the National Mentorship Movement is looking to mobilize over 400 more volunteer mentors in the next 2 months. It's for a specific program. I was chatting to Dave Wilson on my show about it last night, and it's about supporting unemployed youth going through a work readiness program run by the Da Vinci Institute. It's on behalf of the GCRA, which is the Gauteng City Region Academy, and that's part of the Gauteng Department of Education. So they'd love to hear from you. If you want to become a mentor, you can contact them. You can contact Dave Wilson at dave.wilson@mentorshipmovement.coza, or you can register as a mentor on the platform. Just go to mentorshipmovement.co.za. Now, South Korea, is a phenomenal example of what a country can achieve in a generation. South Korea's experience was of rapid economic growth, and it presents a compelling success model for developing countries on the African continent in particular. It's one of a few countries that made the remarkable transition in only 3 decades from a resource-poor, low-income nation to a high-income economy, and now one of the leaders in the world of the much hackneyed and overused term Fourth Industrial Revolution. But in South Korea, they mean it when they talk 4IR. Now, amid the current COVID-19 pandemic, South Korea has also successfully shown the way by managing to contain the coronavirus outbreak without shutting down its economy, and it's now taking some stringent measures to prevent a possible second wave. I think a big part of what South Korea has achieved, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it shortly, was on the back of developing its human capital stock. And that's something the World Bank scores South Africa particularly poorly at, thanks largely to some legacy issues that we've yet to deal sufficiently with. Well, do note that roughly 40% of the focus over the next hour is going to be a discussion on Africa's developments and how they pertain to Africa and South Africa. But due to our current challenges around COVID-19, I'm sure you'd all like to know how South Korea dealt with the coronavirus at the start of the pandemic, despite not closing down its economy. It's a big debate that we're having here currently. So we'll keep 20 minutes of the webinar to discuss this issue, particularly now that South Korea is preparing for the second wave. With that, I'd like to introduce your 2 presenters. Dr. Jong-Dae Park is the South Korean ambassador in South Africa, a specialist in African development, having written a book, Reinventing Africa's Development, Linking Africa to the Korean Development Model was the title of that book. And I think, Ambassador, your association in Africa goes back to the early 1970s, so really a long and rich history with South Africa. When you went to school as a teenager in Uganda, and your father had a diplomatic posting. So it's fair to say that you understand the continent intimately. Your father was himself a career diplomat, having served as the ambassador to Uganda. So a very warm place in your heart, I'm sure, that you hold for the continent. Thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to sharing your insights. Next to you is Dr. Martin Davies, Deloitte's Managing Director for Emerging Markets in Africa, Dean of the Deloitte Alchemy School of Management, and Martin, you're a regular on the show, a regular commentator on how we can develop the South African economy, and in particular by looking at various models around the world. So really looking forward to sharing your insights today as well. Just some housekeeping rules before we begin. As you'll see, you're not going to have access to speak directly to the presenters today, but we'd like to encourage you and welcome you to type your comments and post your questions in the chat session. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to pose those questions to the presenters, and we'll get them to respond whenever possible during the webinar. There's going to be a poll on the screen as well. So if you go into the right-hand side of your screen, you'll be able to vote on that poll, and we'll have an indication of results towards the end of the webinar, just to get a feel and a sense of the room and what you think we can learn and what the potential is to learn from the South Korean model. A recording of the webinar is also going to be made available afterwards, and I'm sure Wan Liu at the Mail and Guardian will be able to help you out with that. With that, Ambassador Park, I'd like to put the first question to you, and you can sort of set the scene for us here. And I think the broad question is, what can Africa's leaders learn from South Korea, its economic route and its political philosophies? And are these plans applicable to our continent firstly, and our country maybe? And what role could the leadership generation at a business and political level play to allow the continent to save itself and fast forward its development? And in assisting us to answer this broad question, I think we should remind ourselves of the history of economic growth in South Korea. So can you just take us back to the 1960s? South Korea was one of the world's poorest countries, depended heavily on foreign aid, and just share the journey over the last 50 years to where you find yourselves today as a G20 powerhouse.
Okay, that's a broad question. So let me go through, and if you have more follow-up, I will answer that. Okay, just to simply introduce, South Korea. South Korea is a rare example of a country achieving compressed economic development as well as compressed political development, and it is the only country to have turned from aid recipient to aid donor in just a matter of decades in the second part of the 20th century. And currently, it is one of only 7 countries that belongs to the so-called 50-30 club, which means having a population of more than 50 million, and at the same time, per capita GDP nominal of over $30,000. So I think the key to success, to make everything very simple, can be broken down to 3 things. First of all, I think it was prioritizing economic principles over political considerations. And secondly, prioritizing human capital more than resources or financial capital. And lastly, emphasis and enforcement of accountability for all sectors of the economy, including government bureaucracy, companies, and individuals. And for the question, what can Africa's leaders learn from South Korea, its economic route and maybe ideas? I think the most important thing is that the fundamental economic principles that should be applied are all the same for all the countries, regardless of their level of development, geography, history, culture. It is only a matter of how different countries adapt and do things specifically, taking into account their circumstances that may be different, but the overall stance, posture, and actions are all the same. For example, if you have very sophisticated and good plans, good roadmap, but if you don't implement, if you don't take actions, it's not going to work. So this is a universal principle that must be understood and taken into actions. And African countries must understand their situation is different from the rich countries. And they should be very realistic and practical in the approach. They need to undergo real changes in their mindsets and be practical in the approach. And they need to undergo real changes in a very expedient manner. The speed is of essence to get out of the poverty trap. In rich countries, the issue of development is merely redistribution, how to help the poor by redistributing income. But in case of developing countries like Africa, it's not just a redistribution of wealth. It's a whole set of transformation, changing things structurally, the mindset, industrial structure, capacity, the whole range of things. But the problem is, in Africa, you lack the resources. That's why the country is poor. If you can do with resources, there won't be any problem. The dilemma the African countries face is because they have the challenges to make change all across the board, but because the countries are poor, they lack the resources. So how this can be done is very important, but not to do it is depending on only natural resources and external assistance without changing the mindset to be developmental, and most importantly, without enhancing the management capacity. So economic development does not just come when you just wait for the market mechanism to take care of itself. It does not come, automatically with the lapse of time, but must be worked on very aggressively through hard work, discipline. In other words, the leadership must bring people on board to participate and be the drivers together. And just briefly, to sketch the Korea's experience, we went through the Korean War in 1950-53, in which 3 million people, perished. It's one of the poorest countries on earth, and without any, natural resources to speak of. Very, resource poor country, and only having, human resources to rely on. So we had no choice but to heavily depend on human resources and stress the importance of human capacity. So we started in early 1960s, starting with labor-intensive light industry building, and started off with export promotion policies, and that was successful. Then 10 years later, early 70s, we shifted to heavy and chemical industries policy, with petrochemicals, automobiles, machine tools, shipbuilding, electronics, and steel, which were also successful. But what is also important at this time in 1970s, we did not only industrialize, but took care of a rural development, because it's important to bring everybody on board together. And the rural area was lagging behind in terms of income. So there was this movement, New Village movement, we call Semeorundong, that instilled confidence and self-dependence in the people, which were also very successful. So it was on that track that we moved to 1980s, when we had more policy focused on stabilization, quality of development instead of just a rapid development, and operating our institution systems. And 90s was the age of globalization. We were at the peak of high growth, but as you know, in 1997, we were hit by Asia financial crisis, which seriously, hurt our, esteem. But we had to go through very hard, structural reforms and make sacrifices. And through that successful effort, we came on top. And then we entered 2000s and became a member of OECD DAC, which is exclusive club of the most advanced economies. So it was all through this process of industrialization, economic development that we followed through. And also in the process, our democracy also evolved. So naturally, when there's economic development, people are more conscious of their rights, and there's natural process for democracy. And we had a whole range of leaders. Their philosophy at first was authoritarian rule, focused on marginalization. Then came later, about 20 years later, 25, civilian rule, and also in 1997 there was a transfer of power from opposition to ruling party to opposition party and full democracy. So that was a sketch of our process and some points of success.
Martin, to bring you in on that, and I think Ambassador Park has touched on several areas that we'll probably jump around to. One of them that stands out for me, if you look at where Africa is on its developmental journey, is the fact that one has to follow a linear approach to industrialization. And a big component of that is at first going into very labor-intensive, perhaps low value add type manufacturing and export. What are some of the challenges to unlocking that early stage leg of industrialization in the African continent? Just in the South African context, we have very fraught industrial relations. One can automatically see that is a big handbrake on unlocking that particular sector. What do you see as the big challenge?
Michael, thank you very much, and particularly thank you to the Mail and Guardian and the National Mentorship Movement for convening us here. And especially to my former colleague and friend, Dave Wilson. You mentioned him earlier. Thank you, Dave. Let me start by saying, Michael, the most accelerated learning period of my life, I was a student at Yonsei University in Korea, in Seoul, in the mid to late 90s. And I lived through, and it's almost deja vu. There was the long-term trajectory of Korea you speak about, and what Ambassador Park set the foundation for was that of industrialization. And Korea, South Korea, undoubtedly is the poster child of industrial performance globally. And very few economies, maybe a few Chinese provinces, have been unable, Chinese provinces being exception, to emulate the incredible, as you say, miracle on the Han River you referred to. That's the long-term play, but during a comparison to what we're feeling right now in South Africa, and maybe beyond, we have a sense of crisis, a sense of doom and gloom, a sense of pending depression. I felt exactly the same in Korea in November 1997. It was the onset of the Asian financial crisis. And the Korean miracle, every Korean felt, all my friends felt, that it had come to an end. This is over 20 years ago now. And there was a sense that it's over, we're finished. The IMF had just came in with nudging a $60 billion bailout of the country, $60 billion. I mean, we're talking about a $4.5 billion package currently to South Africa. So you can imagine the magnitude of the crisis that hit Korean companies. But there was an ability to rebound incredibly quickly. Within 18 months, of course, all the rating agencies, we know them, the Fitches, the Moody's, the S&Ps, had downgraded Korea as a sovereign, and Korean companies, the so-called chaebol, the corporates, the Hyundais, the Kias, the Samsungs, the Daewoo's, to junk status. And there was it took 18 months, a record for a post-Asian financial crisis, or post any crisis for that matter, 18 months to regain its investment status and investment standing by the rating agencies. It took countries like Indonesia close to 15 years. It took Malaysia close to 10 years. And I think the sort of thinking is in South Africa now as well, how will we get back to being investment grade? And what are the lessons, the long-term lessons, or what's the direction, what's the recipe for success? I think the long-term lessons of industrialization undoubtedly come from Korea. And you mentioned earlier, Michael, and I strongly discount the notion that Korea succeeded because of foreign aid. There's only one country in the world, only one, that has succeeded through aid, only one. It's called the Vatican. And that's based on a model which simply you can't emulate. It's called Catholicism. But Korea's long-term trajectory around industrialization, as Ambassador Park said, human capital formation is staggering, and there's significant lessons there. That's the long-term play. The short-term lessons that we should be thinking about as a country, South Africa specifically, is how do we structurally reform, a phrase that also Ambassador Park used, to regain investment standing, attract capital, and everything else wonderful that comes with capital, and particularly intellectual capital and the like, expertise, and start to redirect our economy with focus going forward. I just want to, as an opening sort of comment, just position in terms of saying the sense of crisis is not unprecedented. Korea has been through it. It's been through the long haul. It's been through the sort of short-term V-shaped recovery, so to speak, post-late 1990s. And I think there's incredible lessons there. Not easy ones to grasp, even more difficult to implement, but ones I look forward to talking about in this conversation. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that opening introductory remark. Ambassador Park, a lot has been made about creating an environment, a political environment where everyone bought into the vision that South Korea set about establishing in the 1970s, and the role that Park Chung-hee played in that, almost a benevolent dictatorship. How important is it to have those kinds of conditions to lay the groundwork for the kind of development that we saw in South Korea?
Yes, that's right. I think why Korea was able to develop rapidly was a very pragmatic approach from the very beginning, and we used the adversity to our advantage. There's a saying that if you have too much, then there's a little incentive to change and work hard. You hear about the curse of resources. Many countries enjoying plenty of resources. Many of them are poor. That's ironic. But in case of Korea, because we had nothing to depend on coming out of colonialism, independence, but immediately after that, going through civil war and poverty, they had no other choice. But they can either just give up or just try something different. And the only thing to try on was relying on human resources. So it was important for the leaders to galvanize, passion in the people. So I think that kind of enlightenment campaign, the breeding confidence in the people, is most necessary. But I don't see that happening in Africa. It's too much matter of fact, business as usual, and that the timing has been lost for many decades. It should have been done at the time of independence and nation building, but that has the momentum has been lost. But it's not too late. Leaders are leaders because they can push people through their vision, through their inspiration, and the confidence they can gain from people based on their exemplary actions. So I think it's crucial that at this point, South Africa has a huge potential, and other Africans as well. They don't lack the means. They have all the blessings of the good partners. It's only their will that matters, and that the government, businesses, and the people should all come together and laying the basic groundwork. The basic groundwork is very important, like you mentioned it correctly. In the 50s and 60s, Korea laid down the basic groundwork of education reform, government reform to make it less corrupt, and also there's a land reform as well. And most importantly, the empowerment of the people campaign to make people self-confidence and be the owners of their life without depending on aid. In the 50s, Korea was so heavily dependent on foreign aid. At one point, our government budget, about 90% was through foreign assistance, and people were having this problem of not working. They were very idle, and young men were drinking and gambling while women did all the work, and there was a pessimism. And you see this kind of phenomena in African countries. We also went through the same process: civil war, poverty, and some people say there's no hope, but it depends on the actions of people. And South Africa is a much better position. It has all the ingredients necessary. From my perspective, it has too much. You see that we didn't have any of it. So it is just openness of mind, relying on practicality rather than dogma or ideology, and adapting best practice that will really get countries moving.
I like that point, Martin, if you could build on that. And it speaks to what Ambassador Park was saying earlier about the three basic conditions. Economic pragmatism over ideology had to trump, developing your human capital, and accountability. Now, in South Africa, each one of those, unfortunately, for the last 25 years, has been almost reversed. We've seen ideology seemingly trump economic pragmatism. We haven't done very well in developing our human capital stock. And accountability, we just slipped down the international rankings. Are we on the path to recover all three of these key ingredients under the current administration, with the president leaning quite heavily on the developmental state that's well capacitated to drive this?
Well, you use this very loaded phrase, which came about, I think, Michael, remembering back 2007, developmental state. I'm not quite sure. It sounds good, but I'm not quite sure we know what it means. Developmental state has become a euphemism for statism and the, how should we say, the non-marketization of key state-owned companies in South Africa, for better, for worse. If you, drawing from the Korean example, is people often say Korea is successful because of its culture. Culture is a very general word. And I counter by saying, well, you have two countries. One is incredibly wealthy and successful. That's South Korea. The other is North Korea, which is an absolute economic basket case and a really, really oppressive state. And I spent time up in North Korea many years ago. And to see the contrast, common culture, common language, common history, separated by, since 1953 effectively, and yet two entirely different trajectories. One embraced economic pragmatism, one embraced ideology. And how you've seen how, in Korea's case, Korea was ultimately decided to use capital and human capital, which is focused on two key things: competitiveness and productivity. And that's something which is foreign concepts in an economy such as North Korea and the like. But one cultural positive trait that Korea certainly does have, being a very homogeneous state, is an ability to pivot very fast. And I often say you cannot be internationally competitive if you are so internally divided. And I think South Africa is Exhibit A in that respect. Koreans have this, and we see it in many Confucianist-type societies in Northeast Asia particularly, where there's a sense of nation. I often say about China, the greatest quote about China, and it's not too dissimilar to Japan and Korea, where it's a nation state pretending, or civilization pretending to be a country. And I think that to an extent applies to Korea in a more sort of focused micro form. It's an inherent nation to begin with. There's a sense of us, so to speak. And that sense of us allows a focus in every possible respect, be it political, social, economic, and an ability for society to pivot in a very agile manner, for better, for worse. In North Korea, for worse. In South Korea's case, certainly for better. And the way this plays out is that in the very it's not about ideology or theory. It's about being extremely economically focused, pro-business, pro-even corporatization. And this is maybe a different approach to South Africa's case. And I'll give you a specific example. Korea, Samsung, we all know Samsung as a company, incredible success. One company accounts for roughly 20% of Korean exports and GDP, one company. If I throw in Hyundai, we know Hyundai, and I throw in LG, that figures roughly 30% of GDP, three companies. That's unbelievable. So you have this incredible focus of a handful of corporates called chaebol, which have really driven the Korean story. And we're not seeing that in many African countries' cases, which have been unable to create these dominant, internationally competitive global corporations that has really underpinned Korea's trajectory. And one last point, and I was thinking last night, Michael, around, I have such incredible and fond and good memories about my time in Korea. And I pose this question sometimes. And one thing that I brought back from Korea, I want to show you. I brought this back with me many, many years ago, and I've kept it in a cupboard somewhere, and I found it last night. And the question is to everyone listening, what was LG's, LG, think consumer electronics, flat screen TVs and the like. What was LG's first product they ever made? And they still make it today. Let me show you. It's this.
I'm going to have to put my glasses on.
It's toothpaste.
Right. Yeah.
This was LG. So all of you, there you go. I can read Korean here. So yeah, toothpaste. So this is LG's first product they've ever made, and they still make it. They still sell it in Korea. Maybe Ambassador, you still use LG
yeah,
toothpaste?
I use that.
But they still make consumer electronics, and this is incredible. Forget about core competences of corporations, but this ability of Korean companies to pretty much do everything. Maybe sometimes do too much. And there's post 1997, 98, there was certainly a renewed focus. But this pervasive corporatization of the Korean economy, how it bulked up, enabled it to compete with the Japanese, to access global markets, would not have been possible based on micro industries. And I think that's something which is a real driver of Korean success. It's a course of social and political friction in Korea. But from an economic perspective, it's undoubtedly underwritten the Korean success story.
And we almost have the opposite taking place here with many of our corporate champions. Think Sasol, think many of the mining finance houses and some of the big financial services firms undertaking a wave of immigration from the country. Some have come back, and I think of Old Mutual coming back from London, but others like Sasol have bet the farm and rather unsuccessfully on big mega projects in the likes of Louisiana and Lake Charles. So, Ambassador, my question to you then is how you drove this partnership between corporate actors and the state and labor to cement South Korea's industrial growth, using these examples that Martin mentioned of Samsung and LG and Hyundai.
Yeah, I think the keys to success in economic theory, they usually just stress the market mechanism, and the talk is about leaving markets alone or government interventions, binary fashion. But I think the true economic dynamism or the true capitalism comes from not only free markets, but also vigorous, corporations, companies, very important, and also government. Government can really play the role of facilitator of economy. For example, people misunderstand. I think you see example United States as the most liberal economy, but the rate of government expenditure, compared to GDP, is about 35%. In France, government spends about 58% of GDP. So it's a myth that markets is an invisible hand all by itself and does everything by itself. Good government, but the question is, does the government have good intentions and also the capability? And in case of Korea, government at that stage played the role of a facilitator. It did not intervene in the market mechanism directly, but promoted competition and kind of a meritocratic system in which the companies, like chaebols, before they grew up as chaebols, they were very small companies. Small companies, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, all of them, but they grew not because they got government, subsidies, but because they were rewarded by their performance. So there was a rule of rewarding performance and disrewarding performance. So naturally, those companies did well, exported, well. They got more incentive in return, and that's how they grew. And the companies seems like chaebols, only handful of them, but they are huge, and they also have a huge network of subsidiary companies. So many people work and depend on those network of companies. So it has created employment and so on. So it's important that the government really plays an important role, and it's not enough to just outsource everything. Privatization is important, but it doesn't mean that government gives us its responsibility. And development state, people misunderstand. It's not having just SOEs and government in control. It's the opposite. True development state model coming from South Korea is invigorating the market mechanism or reinforcing the market mechanism to make economy more dynamic. So getting rid of those barriers, conditions of market failure, and encouraging performance reward, and that's the way to go. And as I said, it's important to bring people on board. People, when they only think of themselves as consumers, that will not work. In an economy, that has to be balanced. Everyone has to be consumer, but as also provider, supplier. So when you get benefit from your country, when you get service, you also have to contribute. That's the golden rule of the positive cycle of economy. And I think that's lacking in many Western countries as well. There's a concept of welfare state, but they forget that it's not just a unilateral way of just receiving. It also making people have stake in their lives. For example, we talk about Nordic countries, how they have high per capita income, but also equal, wealth distribution. There's no, free things in those countries. People receive a lot from the government, but also they contribute a lot. That's the cycle. That's the thing that people miss. You're only not takers, but also you have to be also providers. And that mindset is very important for the government to be together with people and the business as partners.
And back to the issue of human capital development, one can't just have up to 18 million people receiving social grants, not in some way giving back to society in order to uplift that society. But I want to come back to the role of state-owned enterprises, Martin, in the South African context. I think when we talk about SOEs and reward, SOE postings were reward for loyalty to the party. You're not talking about rewarding SOE executives for driving economic competitiveness and growth. And I think we've seen Eskom, Transnet in the past become terrible capital allocators. And you just think of Medupi and Kusile and some other projects that have gone horribly wrong. What a different conversation we'd be having if these projects perhaps were approached differently and we used our big infrastructure build to ignite and catalyze economic growth and create a more competitive, dynamic economy. Unfortunately, that isn't the route that was taken, largely because of political patronage. How does Africa, and this is a common theme around Africa, post-colonial African countries saw liberation movements not adapting to the rigors and demands of running modern open economies. And the mistakes are there for all to see. What gives one any confidence that we're learning the lessons, that we can finally put economic pragmatism over political expediency?
Yeah, you raise a key point, Michael. And, I remember it was early 2008. I think there was a conference hosted by the DBSA, Development Bank of Southern Africa, and it was on the developmental state. And this was post the ANC Polokwane conference. And I was quite intrigued by this concept, developmental state. And the keynote speaker that day was a Korean economist. I forget his name right now, who spoke in the auditorium. And I thought this is very interesting. A developmental state sounds like a good idea. I'm nervous about the word intervention. I'd prefer the word enablement. I'm certainly not supportive of the word ownership. And it started off quite promisingly. Talking about exactly the same conversation was held in 2007 around the Korean model. And that was 2008, sorry, it was quite a long time ago, 12 years ago, and we're still talking about it. So clearly we have not been able to emulate or take the lessons and apply them here domestically. Looking more broadly is I think the pace of economic change globally has been so rapid, driven by underpinned by globalization and technology and all the flows of services, of capital, of labor, i.e. people, of goods. And the pace of the world undoubtedly is accelerated, has it not? I think in many cases, especially in this part of the world, we're not unique. Latin America is the same in many cases, where you have there's a lag between policymakers' mindsets and ability to understand where the global economy is heading. And being in the periphery of the global economy and not being exposed to the same extent of flow as many of advanced economies are, we tend to be on the periphery as observers rather than participants, and that prevents us from catching up, so to speak, in terms of mindset, the word which Ambassador Park mentioned. So where I'm going with this is that in the context of Africa, we're still this sense that, we have resources, i.e. in the ground, and therefore we're wealthy. No, that is so, 19th century. And the Korea, again, prime example. There's many other examples where even the Chinese, Southeast Asian, Singapore, Korea, even emerging Europe, Eastern Europe, countries that have practically no resources but are unbelievably wealthy on a per capita basis. You mentioned the figure, $30,000 nominal GDP per capita, Ambassador. That's probably understated. It's probably much higher in Korea, which is probably around 6-7 times the wealth of South Africa on a per capita basis, but zero resources. What resources does Korea have in the ground? Zero. When you're at a Korean school, and this is I think, Michael, it's very important for us to understand in this part of the world, from Korea, from Asia. If you go to school, college, university in Asia, especially in Confucianist economies, the intensity of competition is hard to describe between students. I experienced it for almost 2 years, and it's really intense, but in a way that drives competitiveness, and it results in this internal, unbelievable competitiveness within the society, and that automatically drives growth. So you're not relying on anything. You're not relying on rent seeking. You're not relying on resources, or as you refer to, social handouts, in whatever form. You're relying entirely on human capital formation driven by this intense productivity or intense competitiveness amongst individuals in the country. And that's the China story. Undoubtedly, that's the Korea story. So I think in terms of, as Ambassador Park said, I think in many cases, countries become complacent when they think they have wealth. When they do not have wealth, you have to, seemingly, apparently underground. The business model is not digging a hole and exporting something where you're highly exposed to fluctuating commodity prices, and there's built-in risk in that model, especially if you're an oil exporting economy, even more so than a solid commodity. So you create human capital formation is the only show in town, and that is underpinned undoubtedly the Asian story in the last sort of 2-3 generations.
Martin, on that point, I want to take some questions, which is why I've got the glasses on. They give me blue alien eyes, though, with this protective layer or anti-glare on them anyway. From Joanna and Corsi, thank you very much. Dr. Park, this is addressed to you. And looking at the role of education policy in developing your human capital, what role did education policy take? And just perhaps take us through the approach to developing human capital that was such a success in terms of building that base.
Okay, yeah. So education is key. Education not only in terms of academic, education, but I think civic education of ethics, moral values, I think was very important, and also vocation training was most important. So in early years of development, 60s, 70s in particular, heavy emphasis was laid in vocational education, how to promote mechanics, engineers that will be put into the factories, and of course about the general civic ethics. The education was important, and that should be had. And also the system in Korea is unique that we teach ethics from early on, from the primary school. So we have this what we call moral ethics and work ethics taught in the primary school, middle school. Even myself, when I entered the foreign ministry as an adult, I had to take examination in ethics. So it's about the social capital, that is the extension of human capital. Human capital is very important, but what is also important is how people come together as a community and have a trust in each other. So social capital is about trust, bond, connectivity, and that's important. I think that's a key success in case of also Scandinavian countries. While they have this wealth, but also equality, they have strong confidence, trust in each other, and everybody do their part. So education cannot be emphasized. It's most important. It should happen not only in schools but in homes, in businesses, in every events, functions, and that is good because it doesn't cost money to do it. It's not expensive. It's only reaching out and impassioning people that's very important.
I think it's a point that comes up time and time again in the chats and the comments here. The ability to drive a work ethic and buying into building a country through the sweat of your brow and doing the right thing, not being corrupted and serving your own self-interests. There are a lot of questions, Ambassador, coming up that are opposing the two Koreas and juxtaposing the two Koreas. And obviously one can think of East and West Germany as different models. One can look at Poland and what happened to Poland pre the Velvet Revolution and post the Velvet Revolution as examples of what happens to countries when they eschew ideology and pursue economic pragmatism. As we are approaching the end of our time, though, I would like just to turn our focus now to the COVID response that South Korea has undertaken. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the few countries not to enter a lockdown. We've chosen, along with many other countries, to go into a very hard lockdown. In fact, one of the hardest lockdowns in the world. Just share a little bit more about the South Korean response to COVID-19 and the decision not to go into a lockdown.
Okay, so ours is kind of a unique case where we didn't shut down the economy, but was able to manage well. And there was a reason why we could not shut down altogether, because of course we are heavily dependent on international relations, foreign trade. Our trade dependency is about 70%, or sometimes even as much as 90% of our GDP. And there'll be a huge impact in our economy. But I think the reason why we were able